In this video, I want to teach you a 4-step process for identifying arguments out in the wild and evaluating them. And this is very important. This is the most basic thing we're going to be doing in philosophy class, and it's a life skill that you can use for always. So the basic 4 steps are these. First, find the conclusion of the argument. Second, list the stated premises. Third, determine whether the argument is logically valid or not. And finally, determine whether all of the premises are true. Let me walk you through each step. So the first thing you want to do when you encounter a text which might contain an argument is find out whether or not there is actually a conclusion in that text that you're supposed to be drawing. If there's an argument, there will be a conclusion that the evidence is supposed to support. One of the ways that you can often identify the conclusion of an argument is through certain keywords. Now, these aren't always present. Sometimes you just have to use context in your own good sense. But when you see these words, you know they precede a conclusion statement. So they're words like therefore. When you see a therefore, you know that what is coming next is the conclusion of an argument. Or the same goes for the word thus, or so, or must have been, hence, consequently, it follows that. All of these are red flags that say, here's the conclusion of an argument. So, for example, take this. Everyone who served on the jury was a registered voter, and Jones served on the jury. Therefore, Jones was a registered voter. Is there an argument here? Yes, there is, because there is a conclusion keyword. What is it? Therefore, the conclusion of this argument is Jones was a registered voter. I know that's the conclusion. I know that the other statements are premises which are meant to support that. The next thing you want to do, obviously, is to list the premises that are stated, the evidence that is given in support of the conclusion that are supposed to lead to it. And again, there are often, not always, keywords that indicate to us what the premises are, such as because, since, for, given that, assuming that, for the reason that, as shown by. What follows after these words is going to be a premise. So, for example, Jones was a registered voter because Jones served on the jury, and everyone who served on the jury was a registered voter. What is your premise keyword? Because. The statement that follows because is a premise. So notice here also that there are no conclusion keywords. What's the conclusion? That's right. It's the very first simple statement that we see in the sentence. Jones was a registered voter. How do we know that that's the conclusion? Well, it precedes the because. You're supposed to draw that conclusion on the basis of what follows the because statements, the premises. So in the wild, a conclusion can come first sometimes, even before the premises that support it. Now, when you identify the conclusion and then the premises of an argument, I want you to formalize the argument. And you formalize the argument by listing the premises first and then the conclusion last in numbering each line. And that allows us to quickly refer to and identify the different parts of the argument. So like this. Premise 1, Jones served on the jury. Premise 2, everyone who served on the jury was a registered voter. And then 3 is the conclusion. Therefore, Jones was a registered voter. So this brings us now to our third step. After you formalize the argument, you've got it laid out in front of you, you need to ask the question, is this argument logically valid? In other words, do the premises necessitate the conclusion? If the answer to this question is yes, then everything is checking out so far. You can proceed to step 4. If the answer is no, that given what I'm seeing here, it's not valid, then we need to apply the principle of charity. We need to ask, is the intended argument here invalid? That is, was the person just obviously making a logical lapse? If so, if the argument's just invalid, no matter how charitable you are, game over. Throw that thing out. If it's not valid, we don't even need to figure out whether the premises are true or not. It fails, okay? However, if you think that the intended argument that the person meant to make is actually valid, though perhaps a necessary premise was left unstated, then we need to add that unstated premise in. We need to spell it out for them. And a lot of times you can do this using the modus ponens magic trick that I taught you in one of our previous videos. And this is why I taught you that trick. Let me give you an example here, okay? First of all, let me spell out for you what the principle of charity is. The principle of charity says that we should reconstruct a person's argument in a way that gives them the benefit of the doubt. We want to put the best construction on it that we can. So, for example, let's say that somebody says this to us in conversation. Jones must have been a registered voter, for he served on the jury. Now, if we try to formalize what they've said here, we can use our keyword for, and we know that that's a premise, and that means that the first statement is the conclusion. So here's what we got. Premise 1, Jones served on the jury. Conclusion, therefore, Jones was a registered voter. Now, that's not valid. Is it conceivable that Jones served on the jury without being a registered voter? Sure, that's perfectly conceivable. There's nothing contradictory about affirming the premise and then still denying the conclusion. The premise doesn't necessitate the conclusion. But we can use our modus ponens magic trick and give the person the benefit of the doubt that they intended to add in premise. There was a certain background assumption which they just took for granted, and they maybe didn't think that they needed to tell it to you because everybody knows that already. And if they had stated this premise, well, it would have been a valid argument. What is the missing premise, though, that would make this valid? Can you figure it out using your modus ponens magic trick? Here it is. If Jones served on the jury, then Jones was a registered voter. Now, look what you've got. Premise 1 is P. Premise 2 is if P, then Q. You've got the raw materials for a modus ponens, and you can validly draw the conclusion, therefore Q. So, if somebody left out a premise, give them the benefit of the doubt if it's reasonable to do so, and fill in the unstated premises. Okay, so where have we been so far? We've identified the premises, the stated premises, and the conclusion of the argument. We've determined, let's say, that it's valid. Are we done? We're not done. There's one more step. We need to determine whether or not those premises are true. Because if the premises aren't true, it's still not a sound argument. We shouldn't accept it. So ask this question, are all the premises true? If the answer to that is yes, then assuming the argument is valid, we should accept the conclusion on the basis of this argument. The argument is sound. But if one or more of the premises is false, then game over. That argument is not acceptable. A good argument doesn't have false premises, even if it's logically valid. A lot of times, however, you might not be sure whether one of the premises is true or whether it's false. You might think the evidence is kind of split here. Probably it is, or probably it's not, or it's 50-50. In that case, your confidence in the truth of the conclusion should be proportionate to your confidence in the premises. Your answer is going to be, well, this argument might be sound. It's probably sound because this premise is only probably true. Or it's probably not sound because this premise is probably not true. That's how you're going to frame it. Now, sometimes in order to determine whether or not one or more of the premises is true, you've got to clarify the meaning of certain key terms, especially in philosophical arguments. There might be slippery terms or technical terms which the author doesn't define clearly enough for you to determine whether or not the statement is true or false. You're going to have to clarify the meaning of those terms in order to come to a judgment about the truth of the premises in some cases. Okay, so once you've walked through all four of those steps, there are four possible verdicts you might give about an argument. Okay, you might determine, and this is the best case scenario, the argument is sound, it's valid, and all the premises are true. You should accept the conclusion of the argument on that basis. You might determine the argument was logically valid, but it's not sound because one or more of the premises is false. So no go. You might determine that the argument is logically valid, but you're not sure whether or not one of the premises is true. And so therefore it's possibly sound, but possibly not, like we just talked about. And then worst case scenario, the argument is neither valid nor sound. And in any argument that's not valid, it's definitely not sound. So if the premises, even if they were true, wouldn't necessitate the truth of the conclusion, no go. It's not sound. So only the first case scenario is one where you're going to accept the conclusion on the basis of that argument. All the others are, well, number three, you might have a qualified acceptance of the conclusion on the basis of that argument. But 2 and 4, no go. And possibly 3, depending on how confident you are.